Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be exploring
Yeah.
the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a figure I'm sure you've heard of,
Right.
but maybe haven't had the chance to really dig into.
Yeah.
So we've got a really fascinating mix of sources for you,
Yeah.
biographical information,
Hmm.
some of King's own writings,
Wow.
and even accounts of reactions to
Okay.
his assassination.
Hmm.
And here's the interesting part.
Yeah.
These sources don't all just paint a rosy picture.
Right.
They bring up some real controversies and criticisms,
Oh, interesting.
which will make this deep dive even more
Yeah.
thought-provoking for you.
That's right. By the end of this, you'll see that King's impact goes way beyond the simple narratives we often hear.
Yeah.
We're going to look at the nuances, the struggles, and the debates that still surround him today.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a little known fact that kind of blew my mind.
Okay.
Did you know that MLK
Mm.
was actually born Michael King Jr.? It wasn't until a trip to Germany
Okay.
that his father,
Yeah.
also a minister,
Mm-hmm.
was so inspired by the Protestant reformer,
Okay.
Martin Luther,
Wow.
that he decided to change both his and his son's names.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's a detail that often gets overlooked,
Right.
but speaks volumes about the role of faith
Mm-hmm.
and social justice
Mm-hmm.
in King's upbringing.
Yeah.
It was there from the very beginning.
Yeah. And, you know, when you look at King's early life, it's clear he was incredibly gifted academically. He skipped grades,
Uh-huh.
started college at 15,
Wow.
earned a doctorate in theology.
Mm.
The guy was a rock star.
He was.
But even someone as brilliant as King faced challenges.
Right.
He was actually accused of plagiarism during his studies.
This is where it gets interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because it reminds us that even our heroes are human.
Right.
They're not perfect, and they make mistakes.
Right.
And it's important to acknowledge that complexity.
Right. I mean, imagine the pressure he must have been under. It makes you wonder, what were those accusations specifically?
Yeah.
How did a young king handle that kind of scrutiny?
Well, the accusations centered around portions of his doctoral dissertation.
Okay.
Some argue that he had borrowed too heavily from other sources without proper attribution.
Oh,
King maintained that any similarities were unintentional,
okay.
and he ultimately defended his work successfully.
So it wasn't a clear-cut case.
Right.
But I can see how that kind of experience, that early brush with controversy,
Mm-hmm.
might have shaped him.
Yeah.
It must have been tough, but he persevered.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this resilience, this ability to overcome obstacles is a theme we see throughout his life.
Now, when we talk about the people who influenced King, a few names really stand out.
Okay.
First, there's Howard Thurman,
Mm-hmm.
a prominent civil rights leader and theologian who mentored King in his early years.
Right.
What's fascinating is that Thurman had actually met Mahatma Gandhi during his travels abroad.
And this connection is crucial.
Yeah.
It underscores that King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance wasn't developed in isolation.
Yeah.
It had global roots
Mm-hmm.
and was deeply influenced by the struggles and teachings of others, especially Gandhi.
It's like a chain reaction of inspiration, right?
Yeah, exactly. Thurman was inspired by Gandhi, and then he in turn inspired King. It shows how interconnected these movements for justice truly were.
Then there's Bayard Rustin, another key figure in King's journey. He
Yeah.
was a brilliant strategist and organizer, a driving force behind many of King's most successful campaigns. But Rustin himself was a controversial figure.
Yes. Rustin was openly gay and a socialist, which made him a target of both internal and external criticism.
It makes you realize that the civil rights movement, while united in its overarching goals,
Hmm.
wasn't always a monolithic entity.
Right.
There were diverse viewpoints, different approaches, and personal struggles happening behind the scenes.
It was a coalition, and like all coalitions, it had its internal tensions and disagreements. But it's important to acknowledge those complexities, to recognize that even within a movement, there are always nuances and competing perspectives.
Absolutely. And speaking of global influences, we can't forget Gandhi himself.
Right.
King actually traveled to India in 1959, a pilgrimage of sorts, to meet with Gandhi's family and further immerse himself in the philosophy of nonviolence.
That trip solidified his commitment to nonviolent resistance as the most powerful weapon for social change.
Okay.
It gave him a deeper understanding of the principles behind it and the courage to apply those principles in the American context.
I'm thinking about the I Have a Dream speech,
Mm-hmm.
probably King's most famous moment.
Right.
But, you know, his message went far beyond that single speech.
Absolutely.
He was a prolific writer, and his words had such depth and power.
If we want to truly understand King, we have to go beyond the sound bites and delve into his writings. That's where we see the breadth and complexity of his thinking.
Like his letter from Birmingham jail, for example. I remember reading that in high school and being blown away by his arguments. Here, he was unjustly imprisoned for protesting segregation.
Right.
And he writes this incredibly powerful letter that is both a call for justice and a sophisticated legal and moral treatise.
It wasn't just a plea for freedom. It was a meticulously crafted argument against unjust laws rooted in both natural law and constitutional principles. It showcased his intellectual brilliance and his unwavering commitment to action.
Exactly. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was deeply thought out and impactful. And then there's The Measure of a Man, this collection of his sermons where he grapples with questions of social and economic justice.
And this is where we see that King wasn't just focused on dismantling segregation. He was thinking about what comes next, what a truly just society would look like, how wealth and opportunity should be distributed.
It seems like he was going beyond just civil rights and starting to envision a more radical restructuring of society.
You could say that he was certainly challenging the status quo in ways that went far beyond simply achieving legal equality. He was questioning the very foundations of American society and its economic system.
Wow, that's pretty profound. You know, one of the things that always strikes me about King is his strategic brilliance.
Yeah.
He understood the power of media and public opinion like no one else. He used nonviolent protests, not to incite violence, but to expose the brutality of the system and force the nation to confront its own hypocrisy.
This was key to his success. He recognized that in order to achieve lasting change, he needed to win over the hearts and minds of the American people. And he did that by strategically leveraging the power of nonviolent resistance and the media.
He knew how to create those moments that would capture the nation's attention, like the Montgomery bus boycott.
That boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks' courageous act of defiance, was a turning point. It lasted over a year, showcased the power of organized resistance, and propelled a young King into the national spotlight.
It's incredible to think that it all started with one woman refusing to give up her seat on a bus.
Amazing.
And then you have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, which King founded to mobilize Black churches in the fight for civil rights.
This highlights the crucial role of religious institutions in the movement. They weren't just places of worship. They were the backbone of the struggle, providing organizational structure, resources, and a moral compass.
And then there's the Birmingham campaign, which was a deliberate strategy to use nonviolent protests, including children, to confront the city's segregationist policies.
Those images of children being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs were shocking. They galvanized public opinion and put immense pressure on the federal government to act. But it also raises some tough questions about the ethics of using children in such a way.
I've often wondered about that. What do you think? Was it ethically justified?
A complex question with no easy answer. Some argue that it was a necessary tactic, that those images were a turning point in the fight for civil rights. Others argue that it exploited children and put them at risk. Ultimately, it's a decision the King and the movement leaders had to grapple with, and it's something that historians and activists continue to debate today.
And of course, there's the March on Washington, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. But what's really fascinating is what was happening behind the scenes.
There were intense negotiations with President Kennedy, who initially opposed the march, fearing it would provoke violence and derail his civil rights legislation.
So it wasn't just about delivering a powerful speech. It was also about political maneuvering and understanding the levers of power.
Exactly. King had to navigate a complex web of political alliances and rivalries, always balancing the need for progress with the risk of backlash. He was a shrewd political operator as well as a charismatic leader.
It's amazing how much he was able to accomplish in such a short time. But as King matured, his vision started to expand beyond racial equality. He began to focus more on economic justice.
And the interconnectedness of social issues, which seems pretty forward-thinking for the time.
He was increasingly vocal about the need to address poverty and economic inequality, arguing that true equality wouldn't be achieved without economic justice. This marked a shift in his thinking, a broadening of his focus to encompass a wider range of social ills.
This is where we see King really challenging the status quo, right?
Absolutely. He was no longer simply advocating for equal rights under the law. He was starting to question the very structure of American society and its economic system. For instance, he began to advocate for compensation for historical wrongs, specifically for the legacy of slavery.
Right.
He argued that Black Americans deserved restitution for centuries of unpaid labor and systemic oppression.
It was a radical idea, a direct challenge to the notion that past injustices could simply be forgotten. He was demanding that America reckon with its history and its ongoing legacy of racial and economic inequality.
And this push for economic justice led him to launch the Poor People's Campaign in 1968.
It was an ambitious attempt to unite disadvantaged Americans of all races to demand economic justice from the government.
So he wasn't just talking about Black poverty,
No,
but poverty as a systemic problem that affected people of all backgrounds.
exactly. He saw the connections between race and class and recognized that poverty wasn't just a personal failing, but a structural issue rooted in historical injustices and systemic inequalities.
But this expanding focus wasn't without its critics. King's vocal opposition to the Vietnam War alienated some of his supporters
Yeah.
and drew sharp criticism from the government and media.
His 1967 Beyond Vietnam speech was particularly powerful and controversial. He condemned American imperialism and militarism, calling the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world.
Wow, I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. No wonder he faced backlash.
It was a risky move, but it demonstrated his unwavering commitment to peace and his willingness to challenge the status quo, even when it meant risking his own popularity and reputation.
It's tragic that King's life was cut short at the height of his influence. He was assassinated in Memphis on April 4th, 1968, at the age of 39. It's a moment that continues to haunt us, a reminder of the fragility of hope and the persistence of hatred.
His assassination sent shockwaves through the nation and the world.
Yeah.
It was a devastating loss not only for the civil rights movement, but for all who believed in the power of nonviolence and the dream of a more just and equitable society.
The night before his death, he delivered his mountaintop speech.
Right.
It's chilling to read it now, knowing what was to come.
Yeah.
He spoke about facing death threats,
Mm.
about not fearing death,
Wow.
about having seen the promised land.
Wow.
It's almost as if he had a premonition.
It's a powerful and prophetic speech,
Mm.
a testament to his courage and his unwavering faith in his mission, even in the face of imminent danger.
In the immediate aftermath of his assassination, Robert F. Kennedy, who was then running for president,
Yeah.
gave a moving speech urging peace and understanding.
Right.
It was a stark contrast to the violence and riots that erupted in cities across the country.
That speech was a powerful reminder of King's message of nonviolence and a call for unity in a moment of profound grief and anger.
Amidst the tragedy, there was a glimmer of hope. Just 2 months after King's death, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, a landmark piece of legislation that prohibited discrimination in housing.
It was a bittersweet victory achieved in the shadow of King's absence, but a testament to his enduring impact.
The man convicted of killing King James Earl Ray
Mm.
claimed to be part of a larger conspiracy and later recanted his confession. He died in prison in 1998, but the questions surrounding King's assassination persist to this day.
And this brings us to one of the most unsettling aspects of King's story,
Okay.
his complicated relationship with the FBI.
This is where things get really interesting. You see, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover
Yeah,
was obsessed with the idea of communist infiltration in social movement,
right.
and he saw King as a potential threat.
This fear of communism was pervasive during the Cold War, and it
Mhm.
often led to the FBI overstepping its boundaries and engaging in illegal activities.
They began surveilling King in 1957, and by the early 60s, they were wiretapping his phones, bugging his hotel rooms, trying to find evidence of communist ties. And when they couldn't find that evidence, they started digging into his personal life,
Right.
trying to discredit him through revelations about his alleged extramarital affairs.
It was a ruthless campaign fueled by Hoover's personal animosity towards King and his determination to silence him by any means necessary.
They even sent King an anonymous letter urging him to commit suicide, a truly chilling reminder of the lengths they were willing to go to destroy him.
It's a dark chapter in American history and raises serious questions about the abuse of power by government agencies.
And what's even crazier is that recordings of King's private conversations from those wiretaps are still sealed,
Wow.
not set to be released until 2027.
What might they reveal? What insights might they offer into his life, his thoughts, the pressures he faced? It's a mystery that continues to intrigue historians and the public alike. It's incredible to think about the weight of that surveillance, those unseen eyes and ears constantly intruding on his life. Yet King never backed down. It speaks volumes about his courage and resilience.
It's mind-blowing, really. Shifting gears a bit when we talk about King's legacy today, he's often hailed as a hero, an icon of the civil rights movement.
Absolutely.
And rightfully so.
Yeah.
He helped achieve monumental changes in American society.
But it's important to remember that legacies are complex things.
Yeah.
They're not static. They evolve and are constantly being reinterpreted.
So you're saying we can't just put King on a pedestal and forget about the nuances,
Right.
the controversies?
Exactly. For example, there's a lot of debate today about how his message of nonviolence applies to our current world.
Mm-hmm.
Some people argue that it's still the most effective path to change, while others believe that sometimes more forceful action is necessary.
It's a tough question. I can see both sides. On the one hand, King's commitment to nonviolence was incredibly powerful and effective in his time. But on the other hand, the world has changed a lot since the 1960s.
And there's no easy answer. It's a discussion worth having, though, as we confront injustice and inequality in all its forms. What does it mean to be committed to nonviolence in a world where violence often feels so pervasive? How do we balance the need for change with the commitment to peaceful methods?
It's a lot to think about. And even within King's own family, there are differing views on certain issues. For example, his wife, Coretta Scott King, was a strong advocate for LGBTQ plus rights and believed that King would have supported those rights as well. But the daughter, Bernice King, has expressed different views, suggesting that her father might not have supported things like gay marriage.
It highlights that even within a family, there can be diverse interpretations of someone's legacy. And it's natural for those interpretations to evolve over time as society changes and we grapple with new challenges.
It's a reminder that we can't just freeze people in time. They were living, breathing individuals who grew and changed throughout their lives.
And their ideas continue to grow and change with us.
Then there's the issue of commercialization, which always seems to come up when we talk about iconic figures. The King family has been criticized for charging fees for the use of his words and image, particularly in relation to the Memorial Project in Washington, D.C.
Some people argue that it goes against the spirit of his message, that his words and image should be freely available to all things. Others believe that the family has a right to protect his legacy and benefit from his work.
I can see both sides. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. I mean, on the one hand, you want to make sure King's message reaches as many people as possible. But on the other hand, his family deserves to have control over his legacy.
It's a balancing act, isn't it? And it forces us to think about who owns a legacy and how it should be used and preserved.
It's a good reminder that legacies aren't just about statues and memorials. They're about the living, breathing impact someone has on the world, even after they're gone.
Exactly. Yeah. And King's impact continues to be felt in so many ways. He sparked a movement that changed the course of history. His words and actions inspired countless people to stand up for what they believe in. And his message of nonviolence and social justice continues to resonate today, even as we face new challenges.
Earlier we talked about King's expanding focus in his later years.
Right.
His growing emphasis on economic justice.
As we were saying, he recognized that true equality wouldn't be achieved without addressing the deep-seated economic disparities in American society.
He saw poverty as a form of violence, a systemic problem rooted in centuries of exploitation and discrimination.
And he was increasingly vocal in his critique of capitalism, even expressing support for democratic socialism as a more just and equitable economic model.
Wait, democratic socialism? What did he mean by that?
Essentially, he was advocating for an economic system that prioritizes social ownership and democratic control of the means of production, with the goal of achieving greater economic equality and social justice. He believed that capitalism in its current form was inherently exploitative and that a more just system was needed.
Wow, I had no idea he was that radical in his thinking. It's not something you usually hear about in history books.
Right. It's often glossed over.
Yeah.
But it's an important part of his evolving vision. He was challenging the very foundations of American society and its economic system.
His Poor People's Campaign was a direct attempt to address these issues.
Yes.
Can we talk more about that? You mentioned it earlier, but it seems like such a pivotal part of his later work.
Absolutely. The Poor People's Campaign was a multiracial movement that aimed to unite poor Americans of all backgrounds to demand economic justice from the government. King envisioned a revolution of values, a fundamental shift in how we think about poverty, wealth, and the role of government in ensuring economic security for all.
It sounds incredibly ambitious.
It was. And it faced a lot of challenges. Some within the civil rights movement itself worried that it was too broad, that it would dilute the focus on racial equality. Others were concerned about the potential for violence and backlash.
So it was controversial even within the movement.
Yes. And sadly, King's assassination cut the campaign short before it could fully realize its goals.
It makes you wonder what might have been,
Yeah.
what he might have accomplished if he'd had more time.
It's a question that continues to haunt us. But even though the campaign was tragically cut short, it left a lasting impact. It helped to shift the conversation about poverty and economic justice and inspired future generations of activists to continue the fight.
It's a reminder that legacies aren't just about what someone achieves in their lifetime. They're also about the seeds they plant, the ideas they spark, and the inspiration they leave behind.
Exactly. And King's legacy continues to inspire movements for social and economic justice around the world. His work reminds us that the fight for equality is an ongoing struggle, one that requires constant vigilance, courage, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Now, we've talked a lot about King's achievements and his legacy of hope, but we can't forget the darkness, the tragic circumstances of his assassination in Memphis.
Right. It was a devastating loss, a moment that shook the nation to its core. And the details surrounding his death are still shrouded in mystery and controversy, even after all these years.
We know that King was in Memphis to support a strike by sanitation workers who were fighting for better wages and working conditions.
These workers were facing deplorable conditions and blatant discrimination. King saw their struggle as a microcosm of the larger fight for economic justice, a fight that he was increasingly dedicating himself to.
And the night before he was killed, he delivered his final speech. I've been to the mountaintop. It's a powerful and prophetic speech full of both hope and foreboding. I get chills every time I read it.
He spoke about facing death threats and acknowledged his own mortality. I've seen the promised land. He said, I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
It's almost as if he knew what was coming.
It's a haunting and unforgettable speech. And the very next day, King was shot and killed on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. The news sent shockwaves through the nation and the world. Riots erupted in cities across the country. It was a moment of profound grief and anger, a collective trauma that continues to resonate today.
The man convicted of the assassination, James Earl Ray, later recanted his confession and claimed to be part of a conspiracy. There have been numerous investigations over the years, but many questions remain unanswered.
And the fact that the FBI was so heavily involved in surveilling King at the time of his death has only fueled speculation about a possible cover-up.
Some witnesses claim that the shot that killed King didn't come from the location where Ray was supposedly positioned. And there are lingering questions about other potential suspects and motives that were never fully explored.
It's a complex and troubling story, one that continues to fascinate and frustrate historians and the public alike.
It's a reminder that even in the pursuit of justice, darkness can prevail. And sometimes the full truth remains elusive, leaving us to grapple with unanswered questions and a lingering sense of unease.
It's a stark reminder that the fight for justice is often met with fierce resistance, even violence. But even amidst the tragedy of King's assassination, it's crucial to remember that his legacy is ultimately one of hope and inspiration.
That's a really good point. His message continues to resonate powerfully today, doesn't it? I mean, his dream of a more just and equitable world is something I think we all share.
Absolutely. And it's not just a dream. It's a call to action. King wasn't just a visionary. He was a doer. He believed in putting his ideas into practice, in taking risks, in getting his hands dirty in the fight for justice.
He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. And he did it with incredible courage, facing constant threats and even violence, yet never wavering in his commitment to nonviolence.
His belief in love as the most powerful force for change was tested time and again, yet he never gave up on it. That's a powerful lesson for all of us, especially in today's world, where violence and division often seem to dominate the headlines.
It can feel overwhelming sometimes, can't it? Like, how can we possibly make a difference when there's so much darkness out there?
I think that's where King's legacy comes in.
Okay.
It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope endures, and that each of us in our own way can contribute to bending that arc of the moral universe towards justice.
He said, "The time is always right to do what is right." Those words feel so relevant today.
They do. And they challenge us to ask ourselves, what can we do right now to make the world a more just and equitable place? What are the small acts of courage we can take in our daily lives? How can we use our voices and our actions to create positive change, even in the face of adversity?
That's a powerful challenge. You know, one of the things that has always stuck with me about King is the story of the blue eyes, brown eyes exercise. Have you heard about that?
I have. It's a remarkable example of how King's legacy continues to inspire action and education.
For those who haven't heard about it, this exercise was developed by a teacher named Jane Elliott in the wake of King's assassination.
Right.
It's designed to teach young children about racism and discrimination in a very visceral and impactful way.
She divided her class into blue-eyed and brown-eyed groups and then treated one group as superior and the other as inferior,
Wow.
creating a microcosm of a racist society. It was a powerful and controversial experiment, but it had a profound impact on those kids.
It forced them to confront the realities of prejudice and discrimination in a way that no textbook ever could.
Hmm,
And it shows how, even in the face of tragedy, something positive can emerge, something that can help us to learn and grow as individuals and as a society.
absolutely. And then there's the King Center, established by Coretta Scott King to carry on her husband's work. It's a testament to the enduring power of his ideas and the commitment of those who continue to work in his name.
The center promotes nonviolence, conflict resolution, and social change through education advocacy and community building. They're working to make King's dream a reality, one step at a time.
It's a beautiful example of how legacies can live on, not just in words, but in actions and the ongoing work of those who are inspired to carry the torch forward.
It gives me hope. You know, when you think about all the obstacles King faced, the hatred he encountered, the violence he endured,
Yeah.
it's remarkable that he never gave up on his belief in love and nonviolence.
His unwavering faith in humanity is perhaps his greatest gift to us. It's a reminder that even in the face of immense darkness, hope can prevail, and that love ultimately is the most powerful force for change.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I'm left with a sense of awe and inspiration,
Yeah.
but also a renewed sense of responsibility. We've learned so much about his triumphs and struggles, his unwavering commitment to justice, and his enduring belief in the power of love.
And now it's up to each of us to take what we've learned and apply it to our own lives, to our own communities, to the world around us.
He once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice."
Yes.
But it doesn't bend on its own. It requires all of us working together to push it in the right direction.
So we leave you with this question. What role will you play in bending that arc? What actions will you take to create a more just and equitable world? What will your contribution to King's legacy be?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's inspired you to learn more, to think more deeply, and to act more courageously in the pursuit of justice and equality for all.